But thank you all so much for joining us tonight as author Crystal King discusses her new book, In the Garden of Monsters, a sinister romance and hypnotic Gothic fairy tale with a fascinating twist on the story of Hades and Persephone. She will be in conversation with Diana Giovinazzo, who's the author of The Woman in Red and Antoinette's sister. And she's also the co-creator of the literary podcast Wine, Women, and Words, featuring interviews with authors over a glass of wine. And a little bit more about Crystal. So Crystal is an author, a culinary enthusiast, and a marketing expert. She is the author of two previous Italy-based novels, The Chef's Secret and Feast of Sorrow. Her writing is fueled by a love of history and a passion for the food, language, and culture of Italy. She has taught classes in writing at Harvard Extension School, Boston University, Mass College of Art, UMass Boston, and Grub Street, which is one of the leading creative writing centers in the country. A Pushcart-nominated poet and former co-editor of the literary arts journal Plum Ruby Review, Crystal received her MA in Critical and Creative Thinking from UMass Boston. And you can find more out about her at crystalking.com. And I'll put both of the authors' websites in the chat momentarily. Again, want to thank the, I guess I didn't do this, but I want to thank the 15 libraries who are partnering with Tewksbury for tonight. I will acknowledge them in the chat as well. So all of us watching live and the many more that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Crystal and Diana for joining us here tonight. And Diana, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be able to do this virtually and to be able to have this chat with Crystal. So before we get started, Crystal, could you, for those who aren't familiar with the book, could you give us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so In the Garden of Monsters is a retelling of the myth of Hades and Persephone, but it's told from the point of view of a model that Salvador Dali brings to a garden of stone monsters, which is a real place, and it's an hour north of Rome. And this takes place in 1948.
We're going to get to the garden itself here in a bit, and it's such a cool place, and it was definitely a place begging to have a novel written about it. But before we get to the monsters themselves, I want to touch base on Vincenzo Orsini and Giulia Farnese, because they kind of make an appearance in the book. We don't want to give away any spoilers or anything, but you definitely feel their presence and in the story. And I want to talk about them and Vincenzo's influence on the garden.
Yeah, so actually Vicino.
Vicino, I'm sorry.
That's okay. The Italians, as you know, have names that are often a little interesting. So the garden is a real place. I'm actually going to share my screen really quickly because I think that this will help give some context. Share my screen. Okay. And can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. All right. So the place is called the Sacro Bosco, which means the sacred wood. And Vicino Orsini is this guy. And we believe that it's this guy. This is a painting by Lorenzo Lotto in 1530. And Vicino Orsini, his name was so he was married to Giulia Farnese, and Giulia Farnese is not the Giulia Farnese that you might have known that was married to one of the Medici popes, but it was a relation of hers. The Italians also share a lot of the names. So the Giulia Farnese, that was his wife, was somebody who took care of the garden, or took care of the palazzo and his affairs while he was away as a condottiero, or a mercenary, on behalf of the Pope. And so she took care of everything while he was gone, including the development of some of the garden. And so she figures in the book a little bit at the beginning, and so does Vicino. I'm not giving away too much. The very opening scene is one where they are welcoming a new cook into their house. And the opening of the book is told from the point of view of that cook. And then the book moves into Giulia Farnese's point of view. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want me to wait to
Yes,
show
because
the book?
let's go into the garden themselves, because the monsters are so fascinating just to look at. And even with the descriptions, and the book is so atmospheric. And it's just, they're truly terrifying, because when you go and you look it up, because this book has so many wonderful rabbit holes that you just want to go and like research and go into as you're reading along with it. And but they're so terrifying, these these monsters that you have in the story.
Yeah, and so all of these statues, they're carved from pecorino stone and in place. So when Vicino hired the individuals that would develop the garden, they basically brought in the workers and they just carved the stones in place. This here on the left is the Orco, or the ogre, sometimes referred to as the god Orcus, which is another name for, or another version of Hades, or Pluto, the god of the underworld. And so this is considered to be the mouth of hell. Above his mouth, it says ogni pensiero vola, which means all thoughts fly. And that's because if you are standing inside the mouth, and you can see there, it looks like his tongue. It's actually a table. It seats about 4 people. And there's a bench carved around on the inside of the mouth. But when you are standing inside of it and you're whispering, somebody far down on the path can actually hear everything you're saying, which is why the all thoughts fly makes a difference. And this is his friend Glaucus, Proteus Glaucus, and he represents the point in the garden where he's one of the statues that you first see in the garden. He's one of the first that appear in the book. And it's the idea that all ye who enter here should turn back now while you still have the chance. And but he's a god of the oceans, actually. The garden also has lots of dragons and sirens and all sorts of fantastical creatures. This is me earlier this year in January on Persephone's bench, or Proserpina, as she's called in the book. So the Italian names are a little bit different. Persephone is Proserpina, Hades is Pluto, and Demeter is Ceres. And you can see behind me is the 3-headed dog, Cerberus. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hades and Persephone myth, it's a story of the seasons. And so Hades, and it's also a Sicilian myth, not a Greek myth. And Hades takes Persephone. He sees her gathering flowers at the base of Mount Etna, and he petitions his brother Zeus and says, "That girl is gorgeous. I want her. Can I have her for my wife?" And he says, "Yes, I will go ahead and do so." Meanwhile, their sister Demeter is like, "Where's my daughter? Where has she gone?" But hey, because Hades has forcefully taken her underground, and she learns that Hades has her and is bereft, and then she blankets the whole world with snow. And then the livestock start dying, and people start dying. And Zeus says, "Whoa, you can't do that, Hades. You better give Persephone back to Demeter." And he says, I can't, because she's eaten some pomegranate seeds in the underworld. If you eat anything in the underworld as a living person, you're stuck there, apparently. And so there's some myths that say 3, say 6 seeds, and I play with the 6 seeds. And so the idea of the seasons are when she's in the underworld, it's when there's snow, because Demeter is unhappy. When she's about to come back into the world, Demeter brings spring because she's getting excited. In summer, she's returned, and Demeter is happy. And in fall, she's getting ready to go back into the underworld, and she's sad. Some of the myths do have her as sort of a romantic relationship, but most of the time it's a forceful removal of a rape of Persephone and taken into the underworld. Modern retellings tend to go more the romantic route, which is what I did in this book, to be honest. But I do subvert the myth in a whole bunch of other ways. And I'm going to keep going really quickly. Oh, I'll stop here until we talk about our friend.
Yes, because my next question I was going to ask is about one of the things that I loved about the book was the juxtaposition between Julia, our artist model, and the monsters, and who truly are the monsters in the story. That was one of the things I love. And just kind of rolling into the actual next question, which is we have Dali, which you have here on the page, and he is such a fascinating person. And we in the modern age have a tendency to think of him as this kooky old man. But in reality, it was so much different than how we perceive him today. What were some of those things that were interesting and weird and controversial about him, and how did you reconcile that with the character that you have in the book?
Yeah, so so Dali, I wasn't sure I wanted to write about him. One of the things that's really interesting about the garden, though, is that when Vicino Orsini developed it in the late 1500s, after he died, it was overgrown for almost 400 years. And it was discovered in the 20s, 30s, or 40s by these surrealist artists, one of whom was Salvador Dali, who went there. And he filmed a tiny movie, of which this is one of the stills. This is another one of the shots from the movie. This is also the Casa Storta, or the Twisted House, sometimes called the Casa Pendente, or the like a pendulum swinging house, because when you stand inside it, you're tilted. And there's a bottom and a top, and he's leaving the top, and there's a set of stairs that go around the side that bring you down to the bottom, or of course up to the top. And here he is with Demeter, or Ceres in the book. And Dali was somebody, because he went there, I thought, okay, should I include him? Do I want to? He's such a strange individual. He was so over the top. And for those of you who mostly only know his paintings, he's somebody that was also known for spectacle and for his narcissism. He was extremely problematic in life. Today, I don't think he'd survive our cancel culture in any way. He was kicked out of the Surrealists for writing a letter to Paul Eulard, who was a poet and one of the leaders of the Surrealists at the time, in which he described a religion that would exclude Black people. He was an admirer of Franco and of Hitler, but I don't think that he was interested in what they were doing and in the world as much as he was interested in the ability that they had to command power and to have people bend to their will. He was a narcissist, and he was interested in specifically that, in having the attention and the adoration of everyone. That was what he thrived on. And so he looked up to people that also seemed to have this. And those were the figures in his life that were interesting to him. He wasn't somebody I originally wanted to include, but the garden is so strange and so surreal. I thought I really kind of need to do this because it made sense for how I'm changing the myth, and how I thought that his strange tendencies could play a role in the garden itself. And Julia is an artist, and she goes there because she wants to learn from Dali, and Dali brings her there to paint her as the goddess Persephone. And but he doesn't believe that women should be artists. He thinks that women should be muses, and that's it. And he surrounded himself with women throughout his life, but he wasn't interested in them sexually, or at least physically sexually. He was interested in watching. He was a voyeur, and he sanctioned a lot of his wife's paramours, and therefore in a voyeuristic sort of relationship. But he just had strange views. I could literally talk all night about his weirdness.
And one of the scenes that stuck out to me in the story was an incident where he was in a scuba diving outfit with dogs, and he had shown up at like some conference, I think it was.
It was some like symposium of artists.
Yeah, and he nearly died was it from heat stroke, I believe, if I'm not mistaken?
That's the scene in the book is actually that really happened to him. He came with like one of those wetsuits that is like the big, huge, like metal ones that we all saw when we were in cartoons and when we were kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he came as he was going to give his speech inside this this suit. It was a diving suit, not even a wetsuit. It was like the old-fashioned metal ones. But there was no oxygen tank. And so he was unable to breathe, and he started to gesticulate wildly. And they finally figured out that he was suffocating. And Gala, his wife, was who's his Russian wife. That's another story. We can get into that in a minute. But she managed to figure out that he was suffocating. She pried off the helmet with a pool cue. And so he tells this story in the book, but that's a real thing that actually happened to him.
There's kind of a gift because Antoinette's sister, I have the King Ferdinand, who was just ridiculous in his own way. And I feel like sometimes it's kind of a gift when you have these larger than life people that you get to write about, that while there are some problematic aspects of Dali, he was also this wonderfully eccentric, strange creature that
He's also very
as
charismatic. People
yeah.
loved him in a lot of ways. And
Mhm.
and even today, he's a beloved artist. I mean, a lot of people don't know this other side of him.
Yeah, and I feel like as writers, it's kind of a gift to be able to play with that image, to be able to write about the image, and you have the material right there in front of you.
Yeah, I had to really play up. Well, I toned him down actually in the book. Originally, I toned him down too much. My editor was like, no, you ratchet that back up and have Julia react to him more specifically. So I did that. And it was good. It was interesting to play with that side of things, to have her react to the more awful things about him. And he does some things in this book that are pretty awful, and but I believe would be true to the kind of person he was.
Yeah, none of it sounds out of the ordinary when it comes to this character as this person based on the
Although
things you
everything he
go
does is out
Google.
of the ordinary. It's so true. He's such a weirdo.
And speaking of his wife, Gala, correct?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
that's how he pronounced it, was Gala.
okay. Yeah, I love to hate her. I'm just gonna say that right now.
She's not nice. So there's a trend in historical fiction these days to take women that have been maligned by history, which a lot of women have been treated so poorly by history. It's part of, you writing books about women who have been ignored by history in a lot of cases. Um, but with Gala, there's a lot of information about both Dali and his wife, and there's many accounts of how awful she was. She used to hit people at parties. When she met Dali, she was in a menage a trois with Paul Eulard and the artist Max Ernst, and she had a daughter with Paul Eulard, a girl named Christine. And when she met Dali, she just abandoned all of that and went with Dali and refused to have anything to do with her daughter for the rest of her life, for her life. And Christine reached out to her multiple times as an adult, and Gala just flat out like rejected any further relationship with her daughter. Um, she was somebody who Dali was extraordinarily faithful to, but she was not faithful to him. She had multiple lovers. The thinking is that based on all of the things that he has written, he's got a couple autobiographies, and in a lot of the autobiographies of other people that knew him, the thinking is that he probably only had sex with Gala or with a woman once. And after that, he mostly watched all of the relationships that she had with other men. And this was a known thing that occurred between them regularly. And when she was in her 70s or 80s, he bought her a castle for her to entertain her paramours, one of whom was the 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 star of Jesus Christ Superstar in the 70s, this young 20-something-year-old, who ended up stealing basically, or taking a whole bunch of Dali's paintings with him when they ended that relationship. But she wasn't a nice person. I'm going to share my screen again so you can see what she looks like. So This is Dali, and this is around the time, like 1947 to 48. She was very plain of face, and not an overly attractive person, but she was somebody who had this sexuality that attracted all of these artists. And there was this phrase, and I mentioned this in the book, but this was a common phrase among the surrealists. They thought it was said that when a surrealist was doing their best work, it was because they were sleeping with Gala.
Hmm,
So she slept,
interesting.
she got around before she ever got to Dali, and probably after Dali. Here's a picture of them. You can see this is around the time before his mustache really became pronounced. That was really more in the 50s and 60s. The picture on the right is one taken by Man Ray, who was a famous artist and photographer. And that's the story there on Gala and Dali.
And going back to something that you said a little earlier, when it comes to Galan and talking, writing about women in history, I feel like people, regardless of their gender, are multifaceted.
Yes.
And to be able to only portray a woman a certain way, either, the heroic aspect of them, not and ignore the problematic side, or not cover some of the problematic women that are out there, like Gala, who was awful. And I'm not exaggerating
No,
that,
she was
as
mean. She was
you said,
horrible.
yes. So it's kind of, it's a good thing to be able to show that wide range of people and who they are.
Yeah, and so with Gala, um, I you do see moments in the relationship between her and Dali. Dali worshipped the ground she walked on, absolutely worshipped her. She appears on in he dedicates his 1973 cookbook to her, the La Dîner de Gala. She appears as the Empress on the tarot deck that they created. She's in countless paintings. Actually, let me show you one of the paintings um, that many of you will recognize. This is one of his most famous paintings, the portrait of a bee and a pomegranate. And I can't remember the name of it because it's a very long name. I should really memorize it. But this is Galah, and he
Mm.
painted her over and over. She was one of his muses. And so she was somebody that he he never stopped loving her, his the whole their whole marriage. And she used him through a lot of the marriage. She was interested in money and that the security that that kind of money brought, and the ability to create a lifestyle as a result of that money. And Dali helped provide that for them. They experienced a lot of challenges in their relationship in the 70s and 80s. And Dali finally broke when they were in their 80s, and she had dementia at the end of their life. And there is an episode where he beats her, but like he just couldn't handle the dementia at one point, and they're old and not in great shape. And many of you who have had parents who are failing may understand some of that. But that was the only time in his life where I think that it's at least documented that they had a real sincere, like he just couldn't handle her anymore. But he put up with so much of her antics throughout their whole relationship.
Wow. Wow. And it's so interesting here. And um, but I want to move on to Julia again, because throughout the book she gives out those Persephone vibes where you see that's those similarities to her and this world that she's brought into. I want to talk a bit about how you were able to create her and as a character within the story.
So Julia is this model, and you learn very quickly that she kind of has amnesia. She doesn't really remember who she is. And so she goes to this garden because one of the times where she felt most connected to herself and who she wasn't sure who she was when she was looking at the painting of that I just showed you of Galah, and the pomegranates, and she was so drawn to this painting. And so when Dali ends up asking for her to be his model, she's an artist at the Accademia in Rome, and she models on the side. She thinks, okay, this is what I'm meant to do this. It's kind of a sign. I need to do this. I'm going to go. When she gets there, she has so there's a few things about the book. The book takes place in the course of 1 week, and there's a few other characters besides Dali and Gala and Julia. There's Ignazio, who is their very handsome host, and he is the one who orchestrates everything that they need in the garden. They're all of the meals, they're, make sure that all of their needs are taken care of. There's Jack, who is this handsome football type player, Jock. He was in the army and he helped fight off the Nazis. And he's somebody that that Julia is somewhat attracted to, but he's also a plaything of Gala and Dali. And then there's Paolo, who is the cameraman who is going to be taking photos, and the movie. There's a movie that Dali filmed, a real movie that he filmed, which you can visit on my website, crystalking.com. And in my book, Paolo is the person who films that. And Julia has a friend named Lillian, who you see at the beginning of the book, and she arrives in the garden partway through the book. And Julia, I liked exploring this sense of how she discovers who she is and how she has this push and pull in the garden. She's attracted to Ignazio and to Jack, but she's not sure about either one of them. Dali starts to become more and more convinced she's Persephone, but she's not sure that's really true. And things just get weird in the garden. There's lots of strange things that happen in this garden. It's not what she imagined it would be when she would show up. And I really loved writing Julia. I think that she's a character that is writing a character who's discovering who they are, I think is an interesting thing to do, because they have to look at all of the things that are occurring to them and process them. So you get to see a lot of like who Julia is by how she reacts to all the things that are happening to her in the garden.
And I love her character so much. And it's like you worry for her. It's like a mother's worry for her in the story. But moving on, I want to talk about the food, because having you here discussing food books, we always have to discuss the food. And we can learn so much about not just the culture, but the time period as well. And we learn so much about Dali through the recipes that you uncovered. And I know you've got some slides here for the recipes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of food. I got to play with food from across eras, but Dali has a 1973 cookbook. And this quote I love from him: Le Dîner de Gala, which is the name of his book, is uniquely devoted to the pleasures of taste. If you are a disciple of one of those calorie counters who turn the joys of eating into a form of punishment, which was very popular in the 70s, close this book at once. It is too lively, too aggressive, and far too impertinent for you. And that is so stereotypical Dali. Everything is like really outrageous and over the top. But Dali's cookbook, so in the novel, there's many dinners. There's several dinners that occur. And some of them are historical, taken from the pages of Bartolomeo Scopi, who is the protagonist in my book, The Chef's Secret. And he had a cookbook that came out in 1570. It's a best-selling cookbook, and lots of very familiar Italian recipes come from that. I play with the recipes of Artusi, who was a famous Italian cookbook author in the late 1800s. Also the medieval text, the Hypnerotomachia Polifili, which is the story of this. It's a novel in medieval times, which is very strange and mystical, and about this guy who has this dream, and he's trying to get his jilted, his lover that jilted him. He's trying to get her back, and he does it through dreams. But there's a dinner that appears in this book where the servers are all, every course of this meal, the plates change color, and the servers' clothing changes color, and the tablecloths change color, and there's just like strange, weird stuff that happens. So I got to play with that in the book. But then Dali, his cookbook comes out in 1973. I give a pre-nod to it. Basically, he's inspired, and so some of the dishes are some that that appear in the book. So this is the cover of the book. The book has so much art in it. It's really a beautiful, strange book. It's more than a cookbook. There's also avocado toast in this. And I don't know if you can see the print or not, but it has 3 avocado pears, 1 lamb brain, minced almonds, rye bread, and a few tablespoons of tequila. So very different from our avocado toast that we have.
Yes.
But
I mean, we can skip the lamb's brains, but keep the tequila, in my opinion.
we could just go there. Yeah. So, but then there's like, he had, here's the peacock with all its little boiled babies, basically. And they're quail. But then he has, so this is actually a painting that's in the book, but he does have a crayfish tower that appears in the book as well.
And
And he has like all of these really strange recipes. I wish I should actually, I don't have them all in front of me, but one of them is like snail saltimbocca. And this cookbook that I did, I worked with on a free downloadable cookbook, which you can get from my website, crystalking.com. And I worked with food bloggers and food historians and chefs to recreate some of the dishes that are in the book. And one of the food bloggers, she created snail saltimbocca, and so that's a recipe that's in the cookbook, and it's an easier version than what's in the Dali cookbook. My husband and I love to recreate dish recipes, but when we started thumbing through this cookbook, all of it is just so over the top, and they're all from French chefs that were from restaurants that still exist in Paris, but were popular in the 70s. These fine, high-end dining restaurants. One of them is Maxim's, which is a very famous Parisian restaurant. And they're just difficult for a home chef to make. Not impossible, but the ingredients are strange, and we just decided, nope, not going there. So, but she did in the cookbook. But you can get that if you go to my website.
Oh, maybe it might be difficult for you in the average, home
Maybe.
cook, but not for Dali. Nothing too strange for Dali.
Oh, he
Let's
just
face
snaps
it.
his fingers and pays somebody to do it, right? So
Exactly. We should all be able to do that in
I
Dali's world,
wish.
right? I know. Now, finally, I know you have the tarot deck that you have talked about, and I want to see those slides on that because those are absolutely fascinating that he created this tarot deck. And can you still get this tarot deck now, or what's?
Yeah, so it came out in 1984, and then it was a limited edition. I think like 700 copies or something like that, or 7,000, very limited edition. But then Taschen has reissued it, and so you can get this. Like, you can get it on Amazon, but I picked mine up at MoMA. And this is the cover of the book. The deck itself, the it's really huge. Like, this is the actual thing.
Wow.
And the book inside is equally big that explains the cards. But it's one of the first decks where the artist reimagined the art on the cards. And there were lots of decks before that that maybe were similar to the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, which we are most familiar with. But the symbolism was all the same. He reinterpreted the symbols on the cards. You can see here the Lovers, which is a card that features in the book, but not with the Dali cards because this didn't exist at the time. But he is El Mago, the magician, and Gala is the Empress. And this image of Gala is actually one that is in many of his paintings. He did this same image of her in some of his more famous paintings. And then the death card, which also features in the book itself. But it's a beautiful and strange deck, and but it's definitely something you can still get today.
That's so fascinating and so cool. And then for our final question here, I'm going to ask, what is it that you are currently reading?
So I'm always reading so many things. I just finished reading Gareth Brown's Book of Doors, which is so good. It's about this girl who comes into possession, this woman who comes into possession of a book that allows her to go from one place to another if she's holding this book of doors. And there's several magical books that appear in the book. It's wonderful. I'm also researching my not the next book that's coming out, but the book after that. And one of the books that I'm reading for that is Marco Polo's Travels. And it is a really cool book. It's basically, he was jailed later in life when he came back to Venice because he had angered the wrong people essentially in Venice, and he ended up in jail for like a year or so. And there was a man in jail with him that helped him write the travels. So he wrote all of this story of like going to India or going to China and meeting Kublai Khan and all of the crazy stories of his travels, and it's fascinating.
That's cool. It's so wonderful. And I believe that is it for our questions tonight.
Excellent. So I will pop back up and we'll ask some audience questions, and I'll relay any comments as well. So Crystal, this question is actually for both Crystal and Diana. So Tewksbury, we have a writing group that meets every month, usually the last Tuesday of the month. We just met last night. We had a great discussion with a gentleman named Clay Stafford, who's the founder of Killer Nashville, which is one of the largest, most popular international mystery writer conferences that's an annual event. Anyway, so long story short, one of the questions I always like to ask authors is, do you have any practical advice for any aspiring authors who might be on the call? So Crystal, I don't know if you want to take that first, but any
Sure.
general advice for aspiring writers?
So, I remember like when I was first starting out, I mean, I didn't really get going into writing novels until I was in my late 30s, early 40s. And that was because I believed that it was so big and I couldn't finish it. And I had read like Stephen King, for example, always says you should write every day. And I was like, I can't do that. I just can't do that. So I wrote on weekends mostly. My first novel, it took me like 4 or 5 years. I wrote mostly on weekends. And then I realized I really liked doing this. And at some point in my future, I actually have a day job that pays me a little bit more than writing books. At some point, I'd like to just write books, but that is not an easy prospect for most authors. And so there's I started realizing if that's something I want to do, I have two options. I can be lucky or I can be prolific. And so, because every book that you write sells your back catalog. So I thought, I don't have control over lucky, but I have control over being prolific. And the only way that I could be prolific is if I sit my butt in a chair every day. And so I decided I was going to write 400 words a day. And that takes me about an hour. Sometimes I write more. Sometimes I'm editing or doing something else, but I sit my butt in a chair for an hour every morning before I do anything else. And I certainly don't think everyone has to do that, but when you do that, something changes with your writing. You suddenly become one with your characters and your story in a way that you just could not possibly be if you were writing it more periodically. And so I would highly suggest that you pick a small goal, even if it's just a couple hundred words, and try to do it more consistently every day, every other day, a few hours a week, but something super consistent because your story lives in you in a way that will just change how you write it.
And to piggyback off of that, finding the time is so hard. Even if you say, okay, I'm gonna stay at home and I'm gonna write, you get more distractions even when you're at home writing. For the most part, I was working a full-time job in a law office when I was writing my first novel, The Woman in Red, and that got published just before I turned 40. And then after Antoinette's sister, I stayed home to write. And you get so much that's going to come at you because you're at home. So what have you? And even when you're working, you've got your work, you've got your family, you've got all sorts of things just coming at you. And for my advice is to have writing to be almost like your self-care time. That's your time. You set it as a priority. You set maybe 15 minutes, half an hour a day. That's your time with your story. That's for you. And be very selfish about that time because and make it a priority in your life that this is my time to write.
And the other question I always ask authors is, what is your origin story? What got you interested in writing? And specifically for both of you, what got you interested in writing historical fiction revolving around Italy?
So when I was, it's kind of funny, when I was in high school, college, I somehow got it in my mind that I hated historical fiction. And I think it's because I had to read James Michener's Chesapeake for some assignment. And I was not interested in it at all. And now that I actually live in this side of the world, I was living on the West Coast, and I have more of a connection with the history on this side of the country. I probably would like it more now. But back then I was convinced that I hated historical fiction. So it's very funny that that's what I ended up writing. But I wasn't writing historical fiction at first. I started writing a story about a contemporary chef, a celebrity chef who had a magical set of knives which had traveled through history with him. And I needed an origin story for the first knife, or for this knife, and so I was doing research and just food history and things like that, and I came across an anecdote about how this guy Apicius in the first century, he was this ancient Roman gourmand, and he died in this totally messed up way. And I thought, that's interesting. I'm going to write that as my origin story. So I wrote a scene about how Apicius bought this set of knives for his chef, and that scene is actually still in the book, Feast of Sorrow. But I thought, this is so much more interesting. I am going to research everything about ancient Rome, and I'm going to write that book instead. So that's how I ended up on that path. And that got me into understanding more about food history in general, which led me to writing about Bartolomeo Scopi. And then my husband's family is from Italy, and my mother-in-law would speak Italian to me from Puglia. So it's very definitely a dialect. And I just became really interested in it. And then when I finished writing Feast of Sorrow, I went to Italy for the first time in 2010. And I thought, this is where I belong. We stepped foot in Rome, and I thought, I've never felt like I was more home anywhere than I was there. And it's still true today. And I go back every year. And I just love the food and the culture of Italy. I just passed my language test to become an Italian citizen when my husband gets his passport. So I'm so excited about that. And I love the people, the food, the culture, the history, the art. It's a place where I really fell in love. So.
And for me, I'm half Italian. My father and his family, he's full Italian. And when it comes to writing in books, if you ask my mother, I was born with a book in my hand. I love to read for as long as I can remember. And I wrote all sorts of stuff, but I never really got much traction. And then I was doing genealogical research on my family, and I was, learning about how we came to the United States. And then eventually those questions of how we came to the United States turned into, well, why? What was going on that was causing my family to come to the United States? And I was having a conversation with my dad, and he was like, you should really look into Giuseppe Garibaldi and what happened with Italian unification. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. And I went and looked it up, and Anita Garibaldi came up, and she was just so enigmatic, so wonderful of a human being that I was like, okay, I want to write a story. I'm gonna try this historical fiction thing. And I fell in love with it. And that's when like things just clicked. Everything just clicked. And that's kind of pretty much what I only want to write from now on.
Yeah, I don't think I could ever get away from the history at this point. Even though the books I'm writing now are more fantastical, and there's still a lot of history in them.
And I feel like when it comes to Italian some of the literature and even some of the history, there is an element of magical realism that we can really play into when it comes to the histories.
Well, because we don't really know what happened, right?
Mhm.
So, Crystal, when writing your latest book, and doing the research for it, uh, anything you learned that surprised you?
Nearly everything about Dali. So he's just such a strange person. Like I and I really grappled with whether or not I should include him because he's so out there. When you read the book, there's all these passages that I took inspiration from his life. Um, like there's it's kind of a spoiler, but there's a passage where he imagines he liked to imagine what it would be like when he died and his body rotted. Like that is something he talked about. He loved the idea of it and what would happen, and he thought about things that we would not think about. um, and I did not like Dali before I started writing this book. And I don't necessarily like him as a person, but he was very charismatic. He was a genius when it came to art. And he was somebody that is arguably one of the most important artists of the 20th century. And I came to appreciate a lot of his art, not all of it. A lot of it's kind of really out there, but there are a lot of his paintings now which I have a real appreciation for, which I did not expect to have. And I own a few Dalis now. I have a couple. When the cookbook came out, there's some Limoges plates that have some of the images from the cookbook, and I have a couple of those plates. And I have a lithograph of he did for the Inferno, where Cerberus is rearing up against Dali or against Dante. And I describe, there's a scene in the book where where Dali and Ignazio and Julia are talking at the statue of Cerberus. And Cerberus in the garden looks very docile. He's not scary at all. And Dali talks about what his imagination, what Cerberus is like, and that his imagination is actually the lithograph that I have, this crazy cool
Very
thing.
cool.
So for this question's for both of you, but when writing historical fiction, how much liberty do you give yourselves? Where's the line between, history and fiction? And I imagine that must be a challenge for historical fiction writers.
Go ahead, Diana, I'll let you go.
Oh, yeah, let me go first.
Yeah, all you.
I was gonna let you go first. For my first two books, they were biographical historical fiction. So for me, there were certain elements within the story that I could absolutely not change, and I would not change. With Maria Carolina, when her sister is murdered by the French, that was something that I obviously could not change. And the way the way she acted afterwards, that change, how it fundamentally changed her as a person, I I couldn't change, and I didn't want to change. And you're doing so much research, but at the end of the day, we still have to remember that this is also fiction. So I like to keep certain aspects of the personality of who they are and specific battle dates and time, tent poles within history that you have to work around. Other than that, you just get to play with things. That's one of the wonderful things about writing fiction versus having to write an actual nonfiction novel about a story.
And so for me, same for my first two novels, they're biographical. So I looked at it like, if we know something about those people, what we know is true, I tried to stay true to it. In some cases where it wouldn't make a difference, I might have fudged things a little. So, for example, in The Chef's Secret, one of the things I discovered in writing it is that there was a comet in the year that Bartolomeo Scopi died in 1570. It was a great comet. And a great comet is one that is seen for like months sometimes or weeks. And in that time frame, it would have been terrifying. People would have been thinking the world's going to end. And so I discovered that this great comet appeared, and I shifted the dates by a few months of this comet because I wanted the comet to be seen on the day of his death, and it closes the book on the day that you discover who Scopi really was. And so I shifted that a little bit, but the comet actually happened in that year, just maybe not exactly. And then what happens is I explain it in the author's note. But there were things like at the end of Feast of Sorrow, when the downfall of Sejanus occurs, which is a true thing that occurred. He was somebody who tried to overthrow Augustus Caesar. He was one of his Praetorian Guard, and they basically killed off the entire family. This is historical fact, but the way they do it is really horrific. It's awful. It's terrible. And it was so, and some things happen that my editor's like, you need to just, you can't do that. I'm like, I can't change history. I'm leaving it. And so some of the really horrific things at the end of that book happened in history. And so I leave the historical things as is. With in the Garden of Monsters, I wasn't playing with a timeline, but I was playing with a historical figure. And so my role there was to try to stay as true to to Dali and Galah's personalities and who we knew them to be, and to show them and their character through the actions and their words in the story. But I didn't have to worry about a timeline. And I found that somewhat harder because when you're filling in the gaps, you've got a framework, you've got the structure for this house, but when you don't have the framework, suddenly you have to make it all up, and I found that a lot harder.
And I think we're going to wrap with this question, and you've touched on it a little bit, but Diana and Crystal, what are next for both of you?
So I have a book that's coming out next year, probably in the December timeframe. We're still noodling on the title and we're working on the cover right now, so I can't really give that away just yet. But I can say it's a contemporary fantasy that involves Greek gods, but they're obscure Greek gods, ones that you probably are not as familiar with or may not have even heard of, because the pantheon of Greek gods is huge. It's really big. But they're stealing happiness from the world. So you can think of it as a reverse Pandora's box.
So for me, there is something, though I am not at liberty to discuss it and what is going on. However, I will tell you this, be sure to go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. I do have somewhat, every few months I'll come out with a newsletter with stuff that's going on, and keep an eye on my social media. Follow me on social media. Diana G Author. I make it easy so not everybody has to spell out my wonderful last name. And keep an eye there, and at some point we'll have some news that I can share.
Oh, and to add to that, actually, if you want to learn more about the garden or Dali, or you want to get the cookbooks, I have a page dedicated just to the garden on my website, and one to Dali, and then you can get all three of my cookbooks very easily if you go there as well to download, and that's at crystalking.com.
Excellent. So Diana and Crystal, I put your website addresses in the chat. I will include them in the follow-up email. As Diana said, please follow Diana and Crystal on social media. I'm sure they're on all the major platforms. Of course, Crystal's book just came out yesterday. Okay, we are her second launch event during her book tour. So in the Garden of Monsters, widely available at your favorite local bookstore and libraries, and certainly online as well. And don't forget, I know we didn't talk too much about it, but don't forget about Diana's books, including Antoinette's sister. Okay, so lots of great reads from both of these authors. Diana and Crystal, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up here?
I would say don't read any of my books if you're hungry. Get a good meal before you start.
I just want to say thank you all so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to catch up with Crystal, and I'm so happy that I was able to do this with her.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
So folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause for Diana and Crystal. I want to thank the libraries in Ashland, Chelmsford, Groton, Groveland, Methuen, Topsfield, Hanover, Lancaster, Bedford, Amesbury, Martin Mills, West Newbury, and several of our library friends from New Hampshire. Also want to give a shout out to Megan Beatty for helping arrange tonight's talk. All right. So for those watching live, when you exit the Zoom, please take the feedback survey. And also look for an email tomorrow with the YouTube recording and additional information about Crystal and Diana, including their websites and their socials. So So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again.
Thank
you
you.
so
Good night,
much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.